kind of part one of Reconstruction. We got through a good deal of this outline that I have for you. If anybody did not get this outline, I have a couple more copies of it. I'm sort of using this as a guide, as a kind of overview for the period. So if you need some, let me know. I want to get back to that, though, and sort of be thinking about this stuff, big picture, and more specifically, what's sort of happening in this time period. I've given you a kind of, again, a general, I guess, overview of Reconstruction, right? We're thinking broadly about this concept of Reconstruction. I'm trying to give you sort of big picture ways of organizing and thinking about all of this detail that you're encountering in this chapter, right? As they talk about key people, places, and things, I want you to have some sort of framework to organize this stuff for yourself. So that one, when you're reading it, it sort of makes some sense. You can read more quickly. Two, so that you actually remember something from this. If your mind is like my mind, random details may not just stick with you automatically. Right? They really need to make some kind of sense in terms of significance. Why were they significant at the time? Why do we care 150 years later? Right? Those are some of the questions I want you to be thinking about. But that's what I'm pushing you towards. So I wanted to continue that conversation today. And thinking about reconstruction. How is the society reconstructing itself in this process? How is it reimagining itself, reimagining this community, if you will, in this time period? I think I can pull up the handout here too, which might help. Talked about quite a few things. Sort of alluded to the fact that it's not just about the politics of Reconstruction. Right? It's not just about the political issues that are happening, although politics are important. I really wanted you to take more of a kind of psychological approach, trying to put yourself in the shoes of people at the time and thinking about what they might be experiencing, going through, how they're understanding their world, how they might feel traumatized by the events that are happening, how they don't know actually what's going to be happening in the future. In terms of Reconstruction, how this really is unsettling in a lot of ways. It really is a tipping point. Right? They kind of know at the time that it's a tipping point, but even now we sort of know that this is going to be a major tipping point in American history. So we looked at the politics of this generally. I wanted you to think about presidential and congressional Reconstruction and their differences. Remember, the basic difference I wanted you to keep in mind is that the presidents are really willing to forgive and forget. Congress is much more interested in punishing the former Confederacy or the South. I keep that sort of stuff in mind. Hopefully the details will begin to make sense in that context. I want you to think about it economically, that in some ways the Union victory was a kind of victory of an industrial economy over an agricultural way of life. Some people saw the North as more modern, right? Some people say this is the first modern war in American history. That we're now thinking of ourselves as modern, that slavery and other forms of agriculture in that sense were maybe backward, outdated, outmoded, not modern. So some folks say this is a good thing because it can help make the nation modern. As a part of that becoming modern, they also may think they need to reimagine other things. Race relations are going to have to be reimagined because this massive population in the South of 4 million former slaves now have a different position in the society. Right? They now have a completely different position in the society, and this process of citizenship is being negotiated. So a lot of things are wrapping around perhaps that economic question. I raised the issue of migration or movement. Right? There's tremendous movement happening. People are moving from farms to cities. They're moving from south to north. Not just the freedmen, but definitely among the freedmen, but also immigrants coming in from outside the country. How is that going to help and shift maybe the reimagining of what the United States looks like? We're moving quickly into a period of massive immigration to the United States. Right? The major immigrant groups in the 1850s were Irish and Germans. The major immigrant groups in the 1890s are going to be more Southern and Eastern Europeans. Millions of Jews are going to come, particularly from Southeastern Europe and Russia in particular, fearing persecution and whatnot. They look, quote-unquote, different. They're not, quote-unquote, seen as traditionally white in this sense. So the country is really reimagining itself in a lot of different ways, as it always does when a new stream of immigrants comes. In the 1850s, it's Irish, Germans, Chinese on the West Coast. Later on, it's going to be other groups. In the 20th century, even more groups. Right, so immigration has always caused the United States to reimagine itself, and continues to do so. That presidential election that will be making reference to immigration quite a bit, because America is always reimagining itself in both positive and negative ways. I used all of that to kind of highlight, or try to highlight, this notion of fear. I think there is tremendous fear and insecurity, anxiety, whatever word you want to use, characterizing this period, which makes sense. I mean, first of all, folks have just lived through a war, a very, very destructive conflict, and now they're trying to rebuild that. Many people think that another war might be on the horizon. Tensions are still very high between North and South, between black and white. There's hostility, there's fear, there's mistrust. People are literally shaking in their boots, you might say, in several ways. And you see this politics of fear manifesting itself in a number of ways. Some of them are racialized. Some of them may have had to do with just a general fear, but they become racialized. An organization like the Klan, for example, sets itself up initially as a kind of Southern social club. But very quickly, they turn their attention to those they saw as their enemies. Those enemies would include African Americans, obviously, who they are now fearful of gaining political power, economic power. Yet they also included, in their minds, the North as an enemy. Republican politicians that go south and try to found schools and help the Republican Party in the South are often attacked, lynched, in fact. We'll talk more about that subject moving forward. So this idea of outsiders, who the enemy is, us versus them, imagined community, if you will. We can use that concept to try to wrap our minds around a group like the Klan, formed in 1867, right at the beginning of Reconstruction. So think about this fear, and we talked a bit about that, we'll talk a bit more about that. In some ways, you see a kind of backlash because of this fear of growing political power, for example, among the freedmen, leads to the organization of groups like the Klan, leads to other terrorist organizations, leads to an attempt to sort of pull the political system back and really go back to the good old days. A lot of folks think, okay, if we can just go back to the good old days, everything will be okay. Now, again, for many people, those old days weren't so good, right? If you were a former slave, you didn't want to go back to any kind of good old days, right? It would have been the bad old days. But we often do this, right? In terms of our memory of history, we think things must have been better way back then. A lot of folks are kind of hearkening back to this notion of the good old days. Whether or not they were actually that good might be something separate. I gave you 2 Latin terms, and I didn't even charge you any extra money for teaching Latin that day. Those are the only 2 Latin words I know. But de jure de facto, right? This notion of in law and in common practice. A lot of times you're going to see changes happening, and sometimes they're literally legal changes, right, that are written down in the books, on the in City Hall. You go down and find a local ordinance actually written down, right? That would be de jure. Or de jure rights that are granted, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Right? Literally, they're written down. They're added to the Constitution. Oops. Subway Surfer. My son's good at it. He's like really good at Subway Surfer. It's crazy. He's only 4 years old. But sometimes we see changes that are just de facto, kind of common practice, everyday reality. They don't necessarily have to be written down. They're just generally understood. Just generally understood. And there really is a relationship between those 2 things, but there's also an important distinction. One's written down, one's just understood. In addition to sort of rights, you start to see racism, racial supremacy, an attempt to return to white supremacy, essentially. And sometimes this happens in de jure form. Literally, laws start getting passed. Sometimes it's just kind of understood. So, for example, I gave you the example of voting. Right? The right of the franchise is granted to at least men with the 15th Amendment. Right? That's a de jure right. Yet, there were some de facto things in place to take away those rights. So, poll taxes. Okay, you go down to the poll. Okay, I'm going to vote. Well, yeah, okay, if you pay your $1,000 poll tax, you can go ahead and be like, what? Wait, what? Yeah, if you pay your $1,000 poll tax, you can vote. No, I don't have that. Who has that? Oh, sorry, that's the rule. You can't vote. And so de jure, you may have the right, but in practice, can you actually exercise that right? Grandfather clauses is one thing on here that I don't think we went into. Anybody know what a grandfather clause is? It's still a term used in law, but this means a specific thing here. But
does that have to do with if you're like, if you go back like 4 or 5 generations and anyone in your family was black, or like if you were I don't know if it was 1/8 black or if you had like any sort of African American in your blood, like going back a certain amount of generations, and you're considered. I don't know.
yeah. Well, wait, that would be racist. Well, you can't do that, right? Well, yes, it did happen. You're right. But also just think about the idea of a grandfather clause. There are ways to use that in a de facto way, too, right? Without saying anything about race, you could say, okay, if your grandfather could vote before 1865, then you can vote. Right? This happened. Well, there are about 4 million folks who were enslaved in 1865, so therefore their grandparents were probably enslaved 3 generations before that, right? So this is a way of kind of circumventing the law without saying anything racially. It seems colorblind, right? But this is taking away the right to vote. This also could take away the right to vote to millions of poor whites. Because especially for things like property qualifications that were in place earlier in American history, many white workers, their grandparents might not have been able to vote if they were a new immigrant. Right? So it's interesting quite often. We'll talk about this from time to time, how often racism and racial supremacy doesn't just hurt people of color. Very often hurts whites as well, whether they realize it immediately or not. All right, so keep that in mind. That's a grandfather clause. If your grandfather could vote, then you can vote. It's a good way of taking away a right to vote. And it might be written down. It might just be a de facto sort of mechanism. Literacy tests. I gave you that example. There's a famous example from the Civil Rights era about a literacy test. If you've seen the movie Selma that came out a couple years ago, they get into this. Basically what happens is, okay, you have the right to vote. Go down to the voting area, you register, and they say, okay, you have to pass this literacy test. These things might be quite difficult, especially in the agricultural South. Literacy rates were lower anyway. This is a way of removing a lot of people from the voting rolls. So during the Civil Rights era, they did this. There's this famous story about trying to register people to vote. I think it may have been in Mississippi. You saw a kind of representation of this in the movie Selma a couple of years ago. What they do is they take this guy down to register him to vote, and he seems like the perfect candidate. It's an African-American guy. He's literate, so they take him down to vote, and they say, okay, you have to translate this part of the Constitution as part of your literacy test. Right? The expectation is there's no way this guy can translate this, right, and kind of explain what that means. So he's like, okay, picks it up, this and that, blah, 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 all men are created equal, translates it. They're like, oh, okay. How did you do that? Well, I teach over at the local college. I teach politics, so I understand this is no problem. They're like, oh, okay. Got a smart guy on our hands, right? Why don't you translate this one? It's in French. What? Yeah, you need to. This is your literacy test. This one's in French. Okay, well, I was in the Army. I was stationed in France for 4 years, so no problem. Blah, 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 blah. Parlez-vous, whatever, I don't speak French, so. They're like, oh, how about German? I happen to speak that. Eventually, they give the person a test, and it's written in the ancient language of Sanskrit. And they're like, what does this mean? God looks at them and says, this means you don't want me to vote. Right? So essentially, the moral is there are going to be mechanisms that are put in place, both de jure and de facto mechanisms to try to remove people from voting. And eventually it works. Right? In Mississippi, as late as the 1960s, the number of actual African-American voters is very, very low. I think it's down to like 1,000 in some places in Mississippi and Louisiana, as late as the Civil Rights era. So when we think about why there's a need for a Civil Rights era and a Martin Luther King and all these people 80 years later, a lot of these mechanisms that are put in place take away the rights that Reconstruction was supposed to guarantee. So you see how that works? You see the difference between de jure and de facto, but you see how they're related? If someone were to say what's a de jure right or de facto right, you would understand that. That makes sense? Intimidation, violence. I told you about the example of South Carolina and how there are all these African-American representatives. Violence and intimidation is used by groups like the Klan or others. Yes, you can vote, but it's made clear that something may happen to you if you do vote. Or voting was much more public then. Right? So the idea is your employer might say, unless you vote the way I want you to vote, don't come back to work on Monday. Right? This type of stuff happened. There might be a bunch of guys outside the polling places with guns, like you're going to vote for the Democratic ticket, right? Click, click, right? Oh yeah. So there's mechanisms used to sort of take away these rights to sort of make people behave in a certain way. These are the de jure and de facto forms that we refer to. The attempt is to roll things back, really to put a system in place that's going to function kind of like racial slavery without racial slavery. So the convict lease system, chain gangs, all sorts of debt peonage, tying people to the land. You need their labor, but you don't want them with political power. Right? You need somebody to pick all that cotton still, but you don't want them voting. You don't want them exercising power in any form. And the Klan is an organization that is one of the ones that's focused on is kind of doing this, right? They had certain tactics for terrorizing folks, trying to make them behave in a certain way. By the late 60s and early 70s, they're very active. The courts actually go after the Klan and prosecute them. And so it looks like the Klan has disappeared by the mid-1870s. It's going to be reborn later on. We'll talk about that. Reborn in the early 1900s, in fact, and it becomes bigger than it ever was before. The second Klan, as they call it. And the second Klan is actually born not in the South, but in Indiana, right in the North. It's going to have between 2 and 4 million members by the 1920s. And they were kind of equal opportunity haters, the second Klan. They hated African Americans, yes, but they also hated all immigrants. They hated Catholics. They hate everybody. They're just haters, basically. Everybody that's seen as un-American. Yet they're powerful enough, for example, to have a march of 50,000 members here in D.C. in 1925. So it's really interesting to think about, these tactics, this group, what their goals were, these sorts of things. Okay, so skipping down to the end of Reconstruction. So all of this stuff is happening, all these rights being taken away, even while the South is sort of occupied as really an occupied area. There are Union troops in the South. There are Union troops in the South supposedly making sure Reconstruction runs smoothly, supposedly making sure folks are following the law and guaranteeing people's safety and things. So if this stuff is happening when the troops are there, you can imagine what's going to happen when the troops are gone. You can imagine how stuff gets really crazy. Right? So if people are doing crime in front of the police, what do you think is going to happen when there are no police around? Think of it in that parallel. The end of Reconstruction. Told you at the very beginning the dates of Reconstruction are open to some interpretation. At 1876, some people say it ends. 1877 is seen as the end of Reconstruction. Right? So on this handout, I have 1877, and I'll kind of explain why. Basically, what happens is you get a slow rolling back of the various advances of Reconstruction. Rights of various types are repealed. Most former Confederate leaders are returned to their posts in government. I remember Congress, especially the radical Republicans, think these Confederates have to be punished. Right? That the leadership should not be allowed to be leaders. Some think their land should be taken from them and given to the freedmen. Right? Some went that far as to think about land redistribution. You've heard about 40 acres and a mule. Right, that comes out of this particular period. There was actually a plan by several Union generals and others to take the land from former slaveholders, divide it up into small plots, and give it to the people that had been working there for free for the last couple hundred years. This actually begins to happen in some areas, but that land would be taken away. So gradually, a lot of these laws get repealed. Most former leaders are returned to their posts. And the Democratic Party would rise in the South, really on a platform of sort of racism and white supremacy. You also start to see the rise of violence and riots and violence, even while the troops are still there. So again, you can imagine how things get really, really bad once the troops leave. Why does Reconstruction end? Well, one reason is it's expensive, as we know. Reconstruction plans are expensive. Right? There's, recently is the attempt to rebuild several parts of the Middle East right after U.S. conflicts there to impose a Reconstruction plan. to rebuild the infrastructure and whatnot. Eventually, Americans tend to get tired of paying that bill. Right? Okay, is it done yet? So after a number of years, a lot of folks are like, you know what? Maybe this Reconstruction stuff wasn't such a good idea. Northerners are saying maybe we should just let the South deal with their own problem. Right, maybe they know how to deal with it better anyway. Let's stop spending money on this. This is made worse, perhaps, because there's an economic depression that happens in the 1870s, especially 1873. A major economic downturn happens, and so there's less money available. Right? So folks start thinking about cuts. This military occupation, for example, is seen as too expensive by some at that moment. Others think you can't justify it. How can you justify keeping troops in the South to make them do things which they may or may not want to do, especially in terms of racial equality and whatnot. By about 1875, Reconstruction is mostly over. Mostly over by 1875, middle of the 1870s. Folks are tired of it. It's mostly over. Most African American agricultural laborers are agricultural laborers or sharecroppers. We can talk about sharecropping as an idea. Sharecropping basically meant it was really an economic relationship that gets established after the Civil War. And what it said was basically this: let's make a deal. You have all these former plantation owners that are suddenly bankrupt. They got all this land, they might have cottonseed and whatnot, but they don't have anybody to work it. You also have millions of freedmen who were primarily agricultural laborers their whole lives. 90% of them illiterate. They're like, well, we need to work. So they come up with the idea of sharecropping. Sharecropping basically says, okay, look, it's your land, your tools, your seed. We'll provide the labor, and we'll split the crop. We'll share the crop. This benefits everybody. You don't have the money to pay us. We don't have the land to work. So let's come together. We'll work the cotton all year, and then at the end of the year, we'll split it 50-50. Everybody wins, right? Sounds good in theory. There end up being various problems with sharecropping, though, as we'll see. One of the problems is that a number of the landowners decide at the end of the year, after the work is done and the crop is split, to not share the crop. They say, okay, thanks for working, but I don't think I want to pay you. Well, okay, I'm going to sue you. I have the 14th Amendment, due process rights. I can take you to court. Various black codes have passed. De jure and de facto forms of segregation have already been put in place by this point that say things like African Americans can't take a white person to court, can't testify. This makes it difficult to defend your rights, right? Despite the fact that the 14th Amendment is on the books, a black code like that, as it was called, makes it difficult to defend your rights. So that's one of the problems with sharecropping. Other problems with sharecropping is folks could kind of, as they call it, run the books up on you. So basically, you get charged for the year being there, right? So you share the crop, and at the end, you're like, okay, we made 1,000 pounds of cotton. You take 500 pounds. I'll take 500 pounds. At that point, the landowner steps in and says, well, wait a second. Out of your 500 pounds, you need to pay me for a year's rent. So let me get back 200 pounds of that. You use my tools, 100 pounds of that. You bought food at my company store, give me 100 pounds of that back. Your kids did this and that, 50 pounds back. Actually, you owe me 50 pounds. I'm like, wait a second, I worked all year and I owe you money? This is exactly how they ran the books up on it, especially folks that may not have had high levels of education, mathematics, whatever, can be finagled in this way. If you have a problem with it, the Klan might visit you. Knock on the door, hey, we heard you and the landowner are having an argument. Right, you want to talk about it? No, not really, thanks, I'm good. Or you might just leave. Say, okay, at the end of the year, my contract is up, I'm out of here. Some people make it illegal to leave when you have a debt. So year after year, folks found themselves falling deeper and deeper into debt because they were working for somebody else. So sharecropping turns out not to be such a great thing. And there are going to be black and white sharecroppers that find themselves in this situation in the South. There is a presidential election in 1876. Moving into an election season now, so we kind of know how politics, goes, especially when there are close races. Right? Close races. This happens in 1876. There's an incredibly close race between the Democrats and the Republicans, very much divided based on region. The Republican candidate is a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democratic candidate is a guy named Samuel Tilden, and they both want the presidency. It's a very close election. They really don't know who won. Kind of like Iowa the other night with Clinton and Bernie Sanders. It's too close to call on some levels. Right? What they do is often what politicians do. Compromise. Give up something, get something. Give up something to get something. So what do they compromise on? What's called the Compromise of 1876. The Republicans are like, let's make a deal. They kind of go in this smoke-filled room in the back and say, okay, we got the perfect deal for you. It's going to make everybody happy. The Republicans are like, you give us the White House, and we'll give you white supremacy. Basically, that's what what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, you give us the White House, a Republican candidate into the White House, we will end Reconstruction. I will end the occupation of the South by Northern troops. And we'll let you handle your own affairs how you see fit, especially in terms of these racial issues. You kind of figure it out. We won't bother you with that anymore. We'll end Reconstruction. The Democrats are like, deal. This is what we've been wanting for the last 10 years. This sounds great. They make a deal. Republicans get the White House. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected. The Union troops are going to be removed. By 1877, really, the last Union troop has been removed from the South, which is, again, why I put 1877 down as the end of Reconstruction. Some say this is the beginning of the redemption period. This idea of redeeming the South begins with the end of Reconstruction. And this is when things are really going to go downhill on some levels. So, for example, here, by 1885, most southern states had laws requiring separate schools on the books. So it may start locally at first, but you pass a local ordinance saying black and white people can't go to school together. You had to have racial separatism. A system of Jim Crow is being put in place. A classroom like this would be illegal. And it definitely would be illegal for me to stand up here and talk to you, right? By 1885, that is, most southern states have these laws. Between the decade 1890 and 1900, you see an explosion in lynchings. Explosion in lynchings, which is an extreme form of racialized and sexualized violence. In 1892, for example, that's the high point, the kind of lynching epidemic would take place. I think like 250 people are lynched that year. Like 230 people are lynched that year. More than every other day, somebody's getting lynched. We'll talk more about that. And really importantly is 1896, major tipping point year. The Plessy versus Ferguson case is passed. I think I've mentioned this case before. I'm not sure. But anybody know what the Plessy versus Ferguson case was? 1896, Supreme Court case. What did it entail?
What was the question?
The Plessy versus Ferguson case. Anybody know what that is? One of the more important cases in American legal history. Yes, sir.
You said that was the white guy who had black ancestry.
Yeah, white guy, black ancestry. Oh, that don't sound right. That makes sense, right? But yes, you're right. Phenotypically, he looks white, blonde hair, blue eye. It was known in Louisiana, where he was from, that at least one of his grandparents was African American, of African descent. In this country, there was a one-drop rule. Right? 1 drop of African blood was seen as making you black. Didn't matter what you look like. This is why we talk about how race is socially constructed. Right? It's about the ideas and the meanings that the society says, the guy had blonde hair. He gets on a train in Louisiana, sits in the white section of the train, and gets arrested. He's like, what are you talking about? Blonde hair, blue eyes, yeah. Look like Leo DiCaprio. What are you talking about? They're like, you're not Leo. Your grandfather's more like Denzel. Right? So it's interesting, too, because this is intentionally done. It's very similar to a kind of Rosa Parks situation. Because there are local civil rights activists in Louisiana that are like, how do we mess with this whole system of Jim Crow, right, that separates people based on the social construction of ideas of race? Right? well, let's get a guy that looks white, but they know is black. What are they going to do? Are they going to arrest him? They're going to let him ride there? If they let him ride, that may destroy this whole system of white supremacy. He's arrested. Why is he arrested? Well, he's arrested because they know his ancestry. If he had done this in New York City, where nobody knew him, he could have rode the train all day in the white section. They didn't want to do that. They really wanted to test the system. Right? They wanted to test the system to see how flexible or inflexible the system of Jim Crow was. Right? So he gets arrested. He sues.
I heard that was like one of the many like little stepping stones that like led up to bigger things like integrating schools and stuff.
I think it definitely is. What the thing is, he takes it all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1896. Initially, it was an 1890 case, I think, when he locally works its way all the way to the Supreme Court. Law of the land, right down the street here in D.C. Supreme Court says separate but equal is the law of the land. Separate but equal is okay. Basically, in theory, the court is saying, okay, you can have separate facilities and accommodations for people based on race, as long as they're equal, right? If you have one hotel that doesn't serve, black people, then you need to have another hotel here where they can go. In reality, though, de facto, those accommodations are never going to be equal. Right? So the law says, okay, you can have separate schools as long as you have two schools in the city. Right? Here's going to be the white school, here's going to be the black school. Now, when in reality, what happened is you have a nice school for white children. Right? They paid about $200 per student to have books and classrooms and internet back in 1890. No, I'm playing. But you know what I mean? In terms of support and services, they had these various things. Then you had the black school. Right? No roof, no chairs, no books. And they say, well, it's equal. There's a school for each. Right? This is kind of the way it played out. And this is going to be the law of the land, not just in the South, but in the entire country. Right? The Supreme Court is the law of the entire country, right? Not just the South. In addition, that ruling is going to last for almost 60 years. Right? It's finally overturned with the Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954. That some see as kind of kicking off the modern civil rights movement. Right? A year before the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King comes on the scene, all of that. So it lasts another 6 decades. So it's really important, right? Separate but equal is going to be the law of the land for the next 60 years, not just in the South, but in the North as well. So you're right, it is a very important tipping point, and it's going to be something that takes a long time to be overcome. Right, long time to be overcome. Any questions about that? Does it kind of make sense what I was trying to do with this handout in terms of giving you an overall